The United States of America has begun mass deportation of Russians back to their homeland. The Trump administration has started mass deportation of Russians from the United States, including even those who requested political asylum because they fled the country from Putin's regime. Today in Moscow, at Domodedovo Airport, the fourth plane from the United States has already landed, carrying only deported Russians on board. The unwashed homeland greeted them as expected. Putin's regime immediately issued draft notices to all the deported men to send them to fight against Ukraine. Apparently, among the deported were both asylum seekers in the United States who were denied, as well as violators of United States laws, including those who overstayed their visas. And now it's reported that among the several dozen expelled Russians, there were also deserters from the armed forces of the Russian Federation. So back home, they were facing either prison or war. But it's telling how just a couple of weeks ago, Russians were openly laughing in the comments under my video about how Trump deported about 50 Ukrainians back to Ukraine. But it turned out that Russians are being expelled from the United States on an even larger scale. My name is Alexei Pechi. Let's discuss this topic together. But before we start, I ask you to subscribe to this channel, like the video, and leave any comment under this episode. Also, subscribe to my Telegram channel, Pechi News. The link to it is in the description of this video. There we publish breaking news as it comes in. On December 9, a flight landed in Moscow with several dozen Russian citizens expelled from the United States. This information was confirmed by several outlets: New York Times, Verstka, and an agency. In fact, the New York Times writes that Russians who are being deported are sent in groups together with Iranians. Among those deported were both asylum seekers in the United States who were denied, as well as violators of state laws, including those who overstayed their visas. This is now the fourth time Russian citizens have been expelled from the United States since Donald Trump's presidency began in January. The three previous deportation flights took place in June and August of 2025, and among the several dozen deported at that time were, among others, deserters from the armed forces of the Russian Federation. What awaited them at home, I think everyone knows. The Russians, just like in the previous deportation, were first taken to Cairo in Egypt on a special flight from Arizona, and then further in the capital of Egypt. The deportees received their phones and belongings, after which they were escorted onto a plane to Moscow. There were no recorded cases of escape this time. However, some deportees were immediately given draft notices at the military office upon returning to Russia. Federal Security Service agents were waiting at the airport and gave them draft notices as soon as they got off the plane. It's obvious that now Vladimir Putin's regime will take revenge on all those Russians who left, for example, at the beginning of the full-scale war from Russia, not supporting this aggression. As reported, a previous deportation flight occurred at the end of August. In particular, on a single day, August 27, the United States authorities deported about 60 Russian citizens from the country. We're talking about Russians who ended up in immigration jails in the United States, lost their asylum court cases, or chose self-deportation, meaning they decided to return to their homeland without waiting for a court decision. And the issue of self-deportation is interesting here in the context of certain Russian so-called liberals. I'll mention them again a bit later. In August, it was reported that among those deported, there were several people who feared political persecution in their homeland, as well as a former military man against whom a case was opened in Russia for unauthorized abandonment of his unit in Sochi. And here they are. He tried to get asylum in the United States, but he lost the court case. In addition, it was reported that during a layover in Cairo, several Russians still tried to change their route, to avoid returning to Moscow, but they were politely put back on the flight to Moscow. Polite officers from one of the Egyptian special services, just like the so-called polite people in Crimea back then, these same polite people took those Russians by the arm and still put them on the plane to Moscow. Reports say all those deported to Domodedovo underwent screening and were interrogated for hours with pressure tactics. Well, what else could you expect from such a homeland? According to the agency, nearly all those deported home were pressured to cooperate with the Ministry of Internal Affairs and the Federal Security Service. Their information indicated several people, including ex-military, remained detained. And it's interesting that with Donald Trump coming to power, the United States, as it turns out, regularly deports Russians even during the war. Besides, even some of these Russians who are inside the United States call it SVO. The nonsense is still there. It hasn't changed. Of course, deportations happened before, even before Donald Trump, but as the New York Times reports, before, those subject to deportation were still allowed to change their destination country during a layover and not return to Moscow. Now, they are not allowed to do that. Maybe Vitkov and Putin talked about this in Moscow, who knows? In addition, let me give you a very interesting quote from the head of the human rights organization Russian Seattle for Freedom, Anna Shumova. Since Trump came to power, deportations have increased. Every month, at least one plane flies to Russia. Sometimes there are large groups and charter flights are arranged for them. And so, Shumova also claims that upon returning to Russia, deported people are interrogated, and these interrogations can last for 3-4 hours. None of those who arrive as part of deportation can just get in a taxi and leave, like in the case of a regular return from a tourist trip. Well, to finish, I'll give you one more quote from the Russian media outlet Verska. And it's not really typical of me to dig into these Russian media outlets, even those that call themselves liberal, but here it's important to show how exactly Russian liberals worry about their fellow citizens. So, the layout says some Russians who are being deported from the United States agree to return to Russia themselves after a long wait for refugee status in deportation prisons. In some cases, people have to live in such prisons for more than a year without the ability to leave the facility freely or see their loved ones, and they themselves are waiting to return to their homeland. However, there are also those who are deported against their will. They may face criminal prosecution in Russia for political or other reasons. In July, it became known about the detention of the deported Perm activist Leonid Milekhin from the United States. He was denied political asylum in the United States, and after returning to Russia, he was arrested on terrorism charges. Later, it turned out that Milekhin returned to his homeland not on a deportation flight, but on a regular private flight. According to media reports, he voluntarily requested to be expelled from the United States. And this episode really amazed me because it seems that Russians just don't learn anything at all. Earlier, let me remind you, one opposition figure named Alexei Navalny had already returned to Russia on his own. And how did all of that end? So I don't understand what this Milekhin was counting on when he was asking the United States of America to let him go home. I just don't get what he was hoping for. Friends, do you find this episode interesting? If you think my work is necessary, you can support our YouTube channel with your donation or a paid subscription on platforms like Patreon, Buy Me Coffee, or by becoming a sponsor on YouTube. All the links and details are in the description of this video, where it says support the Alexei Pechi channel. Use any format you prefer. I will be grateful for any support from you. That's all for now. Take care of yourselves. Goodbye, everyone.